Anyway, this man is listening to this, and I don't know how much he listened to and enjoyed or not enjoyed, but at some point he started going ballistic because his son is sitting next to him, and oh my God, this is going to ruin his son's life. Now, actually, I have a 21-year-old son, and I remember what he was saying when he was 11 years old, and he could probably taught George Carlin a few words. So I don't know, where this family grew up. But anyway, the man wrote to the FCC. The FCC picked up on it. It sent a letter of censure. It always annoyed me, those two words, censor and censure. They actually mean different things, but they sort of are related. A censure is like a stringent criticism. Not quite censoring, but saying you really don't like something. And actually, the FCC not only censured WBAI, but they warned them. They said, if you ever broadcast George Carlin again, this routine in particular, we may not renew your license when it comes to license renewal time. Well, WBAI didn't want to take that from the FCC. In fact, they took this all the way to the Supreme Court. In those days, Jimmy Carter was president. He ordered his Attorney General or Solicitor General, whoever it is, to basically support WBAI, as did the American Civil Liberties Union. By the way, you want to get O'Reilly apoplectic? Just say ACLU. Just a little tip for everyone on the show. Last point of note in the 20th century, a little bright light of sorts. In 1996, the Clinton administration, or actually Congress, but Clinton signed it, passed the Communications Decency Act, which basically said, among other things, if there's any material on the internet that's at all, indecent, they have that word again, they even threw in objectionable, and children have any access to it, then the internet provider, not only the people who posted the information, can be fined up to $200,000 and thrown in jail for 2 years. Pretty similar to what the Sedition Act was trying to do 2 centuries earlier. But unfortunately, in 1798, John Adams was president, and he was succeeded by Jefferson in 1800. And in 1996, Clinton was president. And again, I want to emphasize, he signed that law, and he enacted it into a law that allowed his Attorney General, Janet Reno, to bring a person up on charges. So this is not a Republican versus a Democratic issue. They're both equal opportunity abusers of the First Amendment. And so, however, one good thing is the Supreme Court that eventually heard the case did decide by a narrow margin that written material on the web was close enough to the press that they couldn't in good conscience find the Communications Decency Act unconstitutional. So the enemies of freedom had a temporary setback. And again, it was because of their misunderstanding of media. So that's a good thing, because they didn't realize, and they were caught totally by surprise, that the Supreme Court would think that the internet was in any sense like a press. Actually, I once had a debate with Neil years ago about what a computer was. Neil thought the computer was, as you heard in that wonderful film, a glorified kind of television. And my point of view was, well, it's really a glorified book. And I think we were both right, but fortunately the Supreme Court took the book argument as something they wanted to base their decision upon. All right, now we're up to page 3, the 21st century. I think it's fair to say that September 11th changed everything. I don't even have to say September 11th, 2001, just September 11th. It's impossible to predict what the United States would have been, would have done, where we'd be now in our public discourse had September 11th not happened. We do know a few things. We do know that George W. Bush became president. That was before September 11th. We do know that Al Gore won the popular vote. Since we don't have much time, I won't share with you my views as to how George Bush did become president, and what happened in Florida and what the Supreme Court did. But it is worth noting that clearly George W. Bush, whatever his strengths and weaknesses, is and was no Thomas Jefferson. If I were talking to George W. Bush, I would say to him, I knew Thomas Jefferson, I worked with Thomas Jefferson, nor know Thomas Jefferson. And he would probably say, whatever. So, but nonetheless, I think the decisive event was September 11th, and it's hard to estimate what impact that had. There certainly is a direct impact in terms of the Patriot Act and the way it tried to pry into people's lives, like getting records of what people take out of libraries and buy in bookstores. But I don't think that that has been, by any means, the most decisive incursion on the First Amendment. Instead, that has come, for the most part, from the Federal Communications Commission, which started out in the 21st century as actually not that unreasonable an agency. In fact, Michael Powell was a Clinton appointee, and at some point he said, Michael Powell said, he's now the former FCC commissioner, at some point Powell said that, you know, it's not fair that cable television has almost no FCC regulation because it's not broadcasting over the public airways, it goes through private cables. It's not fair that cable has no regulation or very little regulation, and network television has all this regulation. And so Michael Powell said, I think we should equalize this in favor of cable. He said, let's make network television and radio more like cable. That seems like a reasonable point of view. But then something happened on television, something that concerned another part of the anatomy. This happened during Super Bowl halftime in 2004. The breast that launched 1 million protests. Actually, not as many protests as people may think, because it turned out that about 50% of the flood of protests that the FCC received were generated by one group, the Parents Television Council, headed by Brent Bozell. I've had the, quote, pleasure, unquote, of debating him a few times on television. His debate style is a combination of grunts and scowls. But I'll have a few more words to say about that in a few minutes. But clearly, that incident on the Super Bowl, if we can believe Michael Powell, traumatized him and galvanized him. And he says he was sitting there with his kids, and you know, he couldn't believe what he saw. I guess there was no breastfeeding in his family. And this led him on a campaign to crack down on indecency in television and on radio. And to give you an idea of how far-fetched that has gone and the various areas it's permeated, this gives me one more time to mention S, and I promise this will be the last time. But among the other things that have happened is last year, Fox, not the Fox News Network, you know, the Fox Entertainment Network, I mean, they're the same ultimate company, but they had a cartoon called Family Guy, which a few years earlier they aired some episodes of, and I can't remember, there was a baby and a father, I forget which is which, but in the episode they aired in the late 1990s, there was someone's bare ass in a cartoon figure's bare backside. Well, they got so upset, Fox did, because I guess they don't want to, you know, anger George Bush, their biggest patron, you know, where would they be then? For whatever reason, though, they basically, when the Family Guy was brought back, they pixelated, in other words, blurred out the baby's backside and the father's backside too, because, and this is a cartoon, because a cartoon baby's backside, they went to the trouble of pixelating. Because they were afraid that the FCC would take umbrage.